hello and welcome. Thank you everybody for joining us from all parts of the world this morning, this afternoon, to talk about organisational values. We are really excited to share with you the insights from our research programme looking at the value and also the challenge of organisational values. It's going to be a really interactive session, so do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, to ask questions, and then towards the end of our hour, we'll also go into small groups as well. We asked you, those people who signed up via Eventbrite, we asked you what you'd like to get out of this session, and I know you're really keen to learn from each other, so we're going to make sure that that happens, so it won't just be all of us talking to you about the research, you'll also get a chance to talk to each other as well. So a little bit of housekeeping from me. We are recording, as you can see, so say it is going to be an interactive session, so it'd be great to keep your cameras on. Obviously, if you've got a lot of background noise, it'd be great to switch your audio off. We have also got live captioning on the system as well, which will be down at the bottom of your Zoom screen if it is helpful for you to have live captioning, and that functionality is pretty good, so have a look at that if that would be helpful for you. Before we jump in, I just want to introduce myself and Tim and some colleagues from Fathom. So my name is Belinda Ganaway. I am the Strategy Director of FathomXP. Fathom is a culture activation agency. I am also a team coach. I work with leadership teams and other teams across organisations, helping to discover and articulate both organisational and team purpose and values. So we do a lot of work in this area as a business and me individually, and have done for a number of years, which is why we're so excited to share this research with you. I'm joined by two colleagues from Fathom. Give us a wave. That's Charlotte Dewar and Lorne Armstrong, who you'll get to meet in our sessions and our breakout sessions in a little bit. And then over to Tim, friend and collaborator over in the States. Tim, say hello and tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks, Belinda. I'm Tim McCleary, and when we started this study, I was actually the founder and managing director of the involvement practice here in the US. We're a global change activation firm. We specialize in employee involvement to build strong work cultures. As of February 1st, the involvement practice is now part of Urban Emu, which is an experience agency here in the US, and I became their chief experience officer. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is the second study I've had a chance to partner with the FathomXP team. And I want to thank the team for their just absolutely amazing work both times. It's been a great experience. They're a joy to work with. And I personally want to thank you for participating both in our study and being here for the session today. Back to you, Melinda.
So we're going to do three things with you today. We're going to explore three things. So why values matter, why they matter more than ever, what companies are doing to live their values, and also where they're adding value. This is the kind of like, why bother, if I guess. And we're really keen to make sure that you take away some real tangible learnings from this. So I'm going to hand over to you. That's what we're going to do today, but I'd love to know a little bit more about who we have on the call today. So I have one question for you, which is going to come up in a poll that Charlotte's going to launch. 75% of people participating in our survey are involved in discovering and expressing organisational values. And I'm wondering whether that's the same with our group here today. Yeah, pretty. It's not as simple as that. So that's interesting. So 80% of you are in some way involved in developing or communicating values. 8% aren't, and 12% of you say it's not as simple as that, which let's dig into that a little bit more. So thank you so much for that. We've got another poll that will come up we'll be sharing with you a little bit later in the session. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the research before I hand over to Tim for to give you some of the headlines. So the research was conducted, I say, in the spring. We had 75 respondents across more than 70 organisations. Those organisations were really evenly split by size, so sort of like under 10 people to well over 500 plus people size organizations. So a really even split, which was really, really nice. As I say, about 2/3 of our people taking part in the research are actually actively involved in developing and expressing values as well. I'm sure there's more I haven't told you about where the research has come from. So do ask me questions in the chat if anything that I haven't told you about the background to the research. But first of all, I can hand over to Tim. Sorry about the beeping, to tell us a little bit about the headlines, the key headlines, then we'll dig deeper into those.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Belinda. From the study we conducted, we found some common themes in 3 areas: how companies live their values, how values support companies, and how companies evaluate that support, and how companies express their values. Belinda, as she said, she's going to dig into the numbers for us, but I think you'll find the numbers absolutely fascinating. I certainly did. And we'll have a chance to discuss the implications in small group breakouts, as Belinda said. Our goal is to involve you today versus having you just passively digest the survey results. That would put me to sleep. We want to get you actively involved in this. We call it knowledge in the room. We have so much to learn from each other. So we want to tap into your knowledge and your experience. But before we do that, here are the top lines on each of the 3 themes. When it comes to living their values, more organizations say they live their values today versus prior to the pandemic. And this is supported when they clearly express their values to their employees. The vast majority of organizations we surveyed told us that their values were a support during the pandemic. This is reassuring to hear. Well-crafted and lived values have clear impact. I've spoken with leaders who have said managing through the pandemic was like leading in the dark. And in many cases, their values were a beacon of light to help them find their way through. And then finally, we found some organizations have made changes to the expression of their values since the start of the pandemic. And that's also good news, with organizations taking advantage of the opportunity to revisit and clearly articulate what matters to them most. So with that, Belinda, I'll throw it back to you.
Fabulous. So, as Tim said, we've really been able to divide the insights from this research into 3 areas: how organizations live their values, the support or benefit, or the kind of like why this matters, what benefits it brings to organizations for having effective values that are lived, and also how they go about expressing and communicating their values. So looking in more depth, first of all, at this idea of living the values. It's a really interesting concept. It's a subjective phrase. I use it all the time, actually, and I'm really clear what I mean by it, and hopefully the organizations I work with are somewhat clear what they mean by living the values. But it is necessarily a subjective term. It's not a scientific measure. That said, what we discovered is that now 55% of organizations believe that they are living their values. That compares to 46% before the pandemic. So there's obviously an increase there, which is significant and interesting. What we found more interesting still, with that increase of living the values before the pandemic to living the values now, is 17%. So it's nearly twice as great, that increase between people living the values before and afterwards. And it's that increase is that size bigger among those organizations who have clearly expressed values. So what we can see is that organizations who have clearly expressed values are more likely to be living their values. And also that uplift in the benefit of values, or the living the values, is greatest among that group of organizations before and post. I don't like to say post the pandemic, but before the pandemic and now. That increase still was still visible in organizations that don't have clearly expressed values, but it was only a 2% change. So about half of organizations without clearly expressed values say that they live their values, and that only goes up about 2 percentage points before the pandemic and now. As I said, this concept of living the values is quite a subjective one. So it's something that we dug deeper into with the organizations that we were lucky enough to interview. And it was really sort of described in 3 ways to us, this area of living the values. One, which is in some ways that values are a tool that organizations use in some way. And some of the words that came up and time again were a framework, particularly a decision-making framework. We heard values as being described as a moral compass, setting the direction. We heard values being described as a lens. Again, I guess that links to a framework for decision making, how you look at things. And similarly, that visual metaphor of being a spotlight. So that's the first area where values are, how values come across when they're being lived. We also heard values being described as an anchor. And I think that's slightly different to being a tool. It's something that sort of keeps you away from hitting the rocks, if you like. It keeps you away from uncharted waters or unsavory waters. And the third area we heard, the third way we heard this concept of living values being expressed was in a sort of behavioral context. This was particularly in those organizations that have translated values into explicit behaviors. And when we get that behavioral reference point for how values are being lived, the word that often comes up is being embedded. We've had this expression, embedding values, a lot of times. And when people are talking about embedding values, what they're really talking about is behaviors, creating behaviors that bring those values to life. We were really interested to know how people measure. As I say, we asked people who are on the whole involved in values, is your organization living the values? So that's necessarily one particular perspective. So it'd be interesting to think if we'd asked a greater proportion of people in the organization, would we get that same answer? Interesting, perhaps that's our next piece of research. But we were really interested to know, if you say you're living the values, how do you know? You know, how do you measure? And what we found out is about a third of organizations say they have effective methods for evaluating how well the organization is living its values. And that figure rises to a half for those organizations who have explicitly expressed values. About a half of those organizations say they have effective. So again, the benefit of having clearly expressed values seems to play out in terms of is connected to your ability to evaluate. You're more likely to have effective evaluation. So what evaluation methods are being used? There weren't any big surprises here, I think. I suppose I was somewhat surprised by quite how many people do actively seek to evaluate the impact of their values. So we heard that they were used in, you were measuring the effectiveness of your values through performance reviews, employee surveys, customer surveys, that's an interesting one, and then slightly less structured ways as well. So storytelling, values discussions groups or sessions, and also focus groups as well. So that's where we saw organizers, that's where organizations, or how rather, that's how organizations evaluate how well their values are being lived. So let's move into the second area of our research, which is what we call supporting the organization. So this is the why it matters. So you've got values, they're being lived. So what's the benefit? What was the kickback, if you like, for the organization? Before I share the insights from that, I want to ask you another question as well. So this is the same question that we asked in the survey, which is to what extent were your organizational values supportive of the business during the pandemic? And the answers that the options for that question are not at all, neutral, a little, or a great deal. So I'll just repeat that question whilst you're thinking about it. To what extent do you consider that your organizational values were supportive of the organization during the pandemic? Great, so we've got, numbers are still coming in. So 42% of you said they were a great deal supportive. A third say that they were a little bit supportive. About a third of you are neutral on that. Nobody said not at all. That's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for participating in that. So I'm just going to end that. So how does that compare to our insight? Well, overall, so this is all participants, 8 out of 10 organizations said that the values were a support during the pandemic. And actually, what was interesting is 6 out of 10 people said that they were a great deal. So of those positive responses, 6 out of 10 so they were a great deal. So that's somewhat more than is represented in this group, but interesting nonetheless. Again, what was particularly, we looked at how that correlated to organizations with effective ways of evaluating. And what we discovered that organizations with effective ways of evaluating their values were twice as likely to say that their values were a great deal supportive during the pandemic compared to those without any methods of evaluating. So 50% of organizations with no methods of evaluating, only 50% say that their values were supportive. So there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent here, I think, which is organizations that evaluate are more likely to be able to identify the support, and that maybe if they think they're supportive, they're more likely to go ahead and evaluate. I don't know. That'll be an interesting thing to discuss there. But then again, there is this correlation between effective evaluation of the impact of values and how supportive those values are to the organization. So what we dug deeper in the survey as well, and also in the interviews, was where. So we asked the question, were they supportive of you during the pandemic? And then we wanted to know where they were supportive. So we did a little bit of pre-testing of the survey to identify some areas where we thought that they were adding the most value. And what we found of the areas that we suggested in the survey, that the number 1 and 2 areas where the values added most impact was in shaping and maintaining culture, and also crafting onboarding as well. So the first one, I don't think that's a surprise. Values were of most benefit to organizations in shaping and maintaining culture. And the second area, their biggest value to organizations was helping in onboarding. They were also deemed to be valuable in decision-making as well. What I found quite interesting, we offered 3 levels of decision-making. We talked about business level, team level, and individual decision-making. And it was actually team level decision-making that came out as where values was seen to be the most impactful. And also the last area that we suggested was not in the top 3 that people voted on, but was still up there, the differences were quite small, was in creating connection between teams. And I've heard that a lot, using values to create and maintain connection among teams as people working remotely. We also offered people the chance to share free feedback in the comments and through the interview process as well. And where we heard values are adding impact to organizations in other areas, these areas are all linked, for me at least, which is employee experience and how we attract and retain people, how organizations went about or go about expressing the employer brand, how they are defining the employer value proposition. And I know a couple of people in their comments pre this session wanted to talk about the link between values and EVPs, so we can definitely talk about that. They're helpful in recruitment, they're helpful in performance reviews, no surprise there, promotions decisions, and also reputation and customer satisfaction as well. So a pretty holistic, across the board suite of business benefits in terms of having effective or clearly expressed values that are effectively evaluated. So hopefully some interesting stuff there.
And I wonder if we could pause for just a second. I'm curious, we had 6 people who said they felt neutral about whether the values were supportive of their business. If one of those people who said neutral, if you could just tell us why you said that, I'm very curious to know. Tiffany?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I run a couple of different businesses, but the one I was thinking was one of my businesses is just me. So it felt unfair to depict that. And I'm wondering if you've got a high neutral, because there's some independent consultants or smaller businesses rather than the organization development side of things, if that's helpful.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Was there another hand that I saw go up? Marcia, you just put something in the chat.
Yeah, I was just saying that the organization's values aren't explicit enough in the business, so it wasn't really clear that it was being lived or not, if that's why I was neutral. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
That's a great point, and thank you for neatly teeing up the next section as well, which is where we actually talk about expressing the values. So in our research, we found that it was 2/3 of organizations said that they have values that are explicitly expressed. What we didn't, and we got some feedback in the comments and also in the interview, we didn't, so they might be explicitly expressed, but not necessarily how clearly. There was a link between explicit and clear, but and what we did hear, and some discussion specifically in interviews about why it's so important to make it really clear and to be really specific about what you require people to do with the values. We also found that 1/3 of organisations have refreshed their values since the start of the pandemic. And we had a number of reasons for that. A number of organisations simply said they had the time. It was something that had been on the to-do list for a long time, and suddenly there was more time. Obviously, that idea of more time is really not consistent across all organisations. There was an awful lot going on. We also had people talk a lot about companies humanizing or really focusing on the things that matter, or putting their money where their mouth is, in terms of, particularly have organizations who have values in the realm of caring for people, that those values really needed to be looked at again and dialed up and re-expressed, and to fit for the scenarios or what was happening contextually around the pandemic. So we did hear a lot of reasons why organizations took that chance to re-express their values. We also found that most organizations will revisit and re-express their values when they feel they need to, as opposed to a set point in time. But 1 in 10 organizations who responded say that they never revisit or refresh their values in any way. So again, that was interesting. So why does expressing values matter? So if you can have values that are explicit. So whether or not you have values on the wall, you still have values. You have values, beliefs, and assumptions that operate at a deeper level that will 100% inform and dictate the nature of the culture that you have in the organization. But when you have values that are surfaced and articulated and communicate, that's what we mean by expressed. And what we can see is that adds real value, as we've already talked about. So what we can see is one of the reasons that this matters, having explicitly expressed values, is that if they are hidden or embedded or not available to people have to work really hard at interpreting what's going on, and that interpretation becomes an obstacle. And so equally the clarity of the expression matters again, because if people are investing their time and energy in trying to interpret, they're not necessarily going to end up at the right, or the sort of the right interpretation that you meant when you went about expressing them. So clarity of expression is as important as simply expressing them in the first instance. In the report, we put a lot of time into actually sort of giving some guidance as to how to go about this. But just some of the headlines of that, which is, if you make them, it's really important that values are distinctive. If they're just like, well, of course, it's great to be these things, and that makes sense. They become a little bit hygiene or table stakes, if you like. Values should really be about what makes you as an organization distinctive, particularly if you want people to identify with them and identify with the organization. We also had quite a lot of discussion in our interviews about to what extent values could or should be a true reflection of the culture of the organization, and to what extent they should be aspirational. We never really got to the bottom of that, and it's very much horses for courses. There is no right answer to that conundrum. But what we can say, and I think this matters a lot, is to be really clear which part of your values, or which of your values are aspirational, either where you would like your culture to get to, and which are a reflection of reality on the ground. And where there is that gap, it's really important that you are clear about what you are doing to address that gap. So if you're just, I'm going to repeat the same point because it's a little bit convoluted maybe, which is sometimes organizational values are expressed, sometimes they are an aspiration of how you would like the culture to be, and sometimes they're a reflection of what the culture should be like. And that's absolutely fine. Values can sit anywhere on that spectrum, as long as you're really, really clear where you are on that spectrum and what you're doing to address any gap. And I really like this. We've got Ian Luxford, who's joined us from the Motivation Agency, and he's one of our, has been a tremendous support in this process, and has and just provide this lovely quote talking about his organisation, which he says, our values are a target, they're aspirational, but they are still within our DNA. So I really like that, is that distinctiveness that, yes, they're a stretch, but they're still part of who we are. So I think that's really, really interesting. So
Linda, we've got a question from Lorraine Russell. Lorraine, please, you can come off mute and ask the question. She's asking if the pandemic drove the renewed focus on values versus the more competitive jobs market, and or the mindset change of the new generation of workers.
Yeah, I was just curious if you've come across anything like that in the research, or, you know, kind of the driver behind all of this, because yes, the pandemic drove a lot of change, but if it's in our DNA, is this something we would have naturally evolved to, or is the new, you know, the new workforce really driving it?
Tim, I'll come to you in a minute for your thoughts on this, because it tees up nicely with a kind of like some of our what next thoughts, I think. And I think it's all three. In our interviews, it tends to be people responding in the context of the pandemic, about why this focus and why now. But I agree. I think it's very much a three-legged stool. I think there's very much employee expectations. And we've been talking about glass box brands for a number of years, which is, you know, this ability for potential candidates to see inside the organization and work out what it's like there. And what we know is culture is one of the biggest influence on candidates' decision making about whether or not they should join. So I think that's very much there. And I think the competitive jobs market, yes, absolutely, as well as the context of the pandemic as well. So I think, and the generational shift, I think all of those things, it's probably impossible to isolate them, but in the responses to the survey and the interviews, people tended to come down on the side of the pandemic, but I think it would be impossible to discount those other two areas. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with what you just said, Belinda. I think, you know, often we hear that millennials are looking for a strong sense of purpose. I don't believe that that's just millennials. I think it's all of us. We all want a strong sense of purpose in what we do every day. And having clearly articulated values helps to attract great talent as well, Lorraine, to your point in how strong the job market is, especially here in the US right now.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions in the chat, or anybody else like to jump in with a question?
Hi, this is Kim Meyer.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I mean, I think this is really, really interesting, but there seems to be a sort of underlying assumption that when you use the term values, you're talking about something positive, like purposeful and socially conscious and all that. That's not always necessarily how businesses define their values. Sometimes it's efficiency, sometimes it's profitability, sometimes it's, you know, there are different kinds of things. How did you get around that in your survey? How did you define values in the context of being a positive change after COVID? You know, companies being more socially aware, you know, you understand my question.
Yeah, I think that's a real, and I think it's easy to assume, and there is a sort of almost like a common meme that when we talk about purpose and values, we're talking about for good, and the sort of the environmental, social stuff that's so important, and that isn't always the case. Interesting. I don't think we didn't deliberately go into to look at organizational values through that lens. I think we went in quite open, just asking about organizational values and to what extent they supported the organization. So I think they could have been more of those sort of like efficiency orientated values that don't necessarily speak to the wider public good. So I'm not sure I don't know, I'd need to mull that over, but I don't think it was our intention to set out to understand whether companies were doing good stuff, and whether they were doing more good stuff as a result of the pandemic, and we necessarily tied that to values. but I might have to check my own biases around that. So it'd be interesting. I'm going, Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Kim, first of all, great to see you here. Thanks for joining. I think adjacent to that, the danger is that leadership gets together, has a retreat, crafts the values, and then sends them out to employees. I've seen that happen a lot without actually involving employees who are living them and know firsthand what's really true to the culture, what's authentic within the culture, as well as what's aspirational. Like there's a balance to between both of those. But I think the danger is when just leadership are involved in crafting the values, we can run into things where maybe it's not as positive. Maybe employees don't really relate to the values of the organization as strongly.
So really, I really like that question, Kim. Thank you. I feel like I want to mull on that and come back and have a deeper conversation around that. So thank you.
Yeah, because I think it's an important sort of discussion. You know, there's lots of people talking about how businesses have come out of COVID with a new perspective on social good and all that sort of stuff. And then when you kind of drill down into what that means for them, it's not as clear that it's all necessarily positive. You know, some of it's survival instinct becomes translated into values. So I just think it's an interesting thing to, when you're using the word values, what it means. Yeah, because I'm not sure that everyone shares the same definition. I mean, I think if you look it up in the dictionary, it means the value you put on something, and that could not necessarily be a positive thing. So just a thought.
Absolutely.
Would you like to jump in quickly? It's Lauren here. Only because Kim works in the events industry, which is obviously something we're in, and a number of the people on this call will be from that sector. And if you think about a sector that's been ravaged by over the last 2 years, that'll be one. So whole industry has changed, and there's a whole generation of new people in it. So a lot of the old guard, like Kim or myself, you know, our values are redundant now, really, because things have had to change. What's interesting is the agencies, big agencies that have deliberately, consciously looked at their values again and taken some of the corporate, perhaps profit-orientated elements out of them and engaged employees and thought about what that means for them, have been those that have been able to attract and retain new talent into an industry that badly needs it. So I think Kim's right, that the redefinition of values as something that's authentic, genuine, and positive has been very beneficial to organizations in our sector that have done that, as opposed to those that just carried on as they were.
Great point.
Linda, Randy's got his hand up.
Great. And then we'll come to Kim. The other Kim has got a question as well. So come to the other Kim after that.
Yeah, at the risk of completely derailing this conversation, I'm curious if there's it sounds, Kim, like you're making a distinction about what is good and what is not. And I'm wondering if, just thinking back to like the businesses that were forced to close during the pandemic, I would put a premium on profitability for those folks trying to come back from the pandemic. So that value may be survival, maybe getting back to the ability to employ and feed families and those kind of things. And I'm curious if some of the things that you listed are necessarily, is it truly black and white, good versus bad values, or is there kind of a range of things which, when taken too far, could be problematic, or are there things that we believe are just simply innate goods which will in turn yield the things that should come with being a good citizen, being a good person, et cetera, et cetera? It caught my ear when the use of the term good and applying it to some of those various things. It sounded a little curious.
Tim, do you want to pick that up first, or?
Well, I think, you know, this is the issue that I think a lot of organizations, you know, that I deal with. Again, a lot of them are event agencies who are trying to sort of semi-reinvent themselves after what they've just experienced for the last 2 years with their traditional business models. And I think a lot of them are, and in particular, as they look to recruit younger talent and more diverse talent into their organizations, you know, are starting to the question becomes, is it purpose over profit, or is it purpose that creates profit? And how do those two things work? And where on your value chain or scale is profit versus purpose versus, again, I think a lot of agencies are struggling with this, because their more traditional model was one that was efficiency, doing the same thing over and over again as efficiently as they could for the maximum amount of profit. And a lot of the purposeful activities like sustainability, lots of other, sort of more social related causes were left on the wayside. So it's a challenge and an opportunity, I think, for a lot of these agencies to really think, how do they embed into their operating model values that their younger people value, diversity, sustainability, these kinds of things, and still be profitable in a new kind of model. And that's a challenge for a lot of organizations.
Right, interesting point. I'm going to probably move us on to just other questions to make sure that everybody gets a chance. I can see Kim and Marcia, now you have your hand up as well. So I'll come to the first Kim, the other Kim.
Just call me Miami Kim today.
Miami Kim.
Miami Kim, just showing off. So I think what was really interesting, and it sort of now follows on from the discussion that we've just been having. If organizations prior to the pandemic were all about efficiency and profit and sort of controlling how they got that, I wonder in my cynical brain whether this whole new focus on values is more about so I know what my employees are doing. I feel out of control. So how do I re-engage? Because it's really difficult when employees are working from home to get a gauge on how everybody's feeling and is everybody doing the right thing and all of those sorts of things. So there's a slightly cynical part of me that goes, everybody's talking about values and some of the intent is good, but actually it's more about, how do I feel like I'm back in control of the people in my organization and the results they produce?
That's very interesting. So values as a method of
a weapon.
I have definitely seen values being weaponized. Yeah. You are not being integral. You are not being courageous enough. I'm going to hit you with a big stick until you are. Definitely seeing values being weaponized. Marcia.
Hi, thanks very much. I just wanted to thank Randy for sort of making his point, which kind of reiterated something I'd put in the chat about when we're looking at values, it's always a matter of perspective as to whether something's positive or negative, and just actually I think it's far more helpful not to look at values in terms of those binaries, but simply as sometimes a spectrum. So, for example, talking about profitability or efficiency as being maybe more individualistic versus the sort of social purpose or corporate social values as being more collectivistic. It's not really about right or wrong in those circumstances. They're just different perspectives, different places on the spectrum, where it's just a sense of trying to understand that at a particular point, an organization might be in a particular place where their focus is on a particular value, and that's the perspective that they're coming from at that time. And just to make the point that being an individualist doesn't mean that you can't act in a collectivist way. It's just being able to make the shifts in what I would describe as a culturally intelligent way to reach a different point. So it's not always that's straightforward as talking about those things, and just to understand things aren't necessarily about right or wrong, just different.
Yes, thanks, Marcia. It's a really great point. Liz, you've got your hand up. Love to hear your thoughts. And I just wanted, I don't think I said it at the very beginning, a thank you to Liz Barnes from Evoca, who's a behavioural insights agency who helped us with the clever bits of the research behind the scenes. So Liz, over to you.
Just to say, from a sort of methodological point of view, in terms of what we actually asked and therefore to some extent how people are responding, the first 3 questions, there was no definition of values. Okay, deliberate definition of values. And the first 3 questions are quite open. Do you work for an organisation where its values are implied or expressed? But then by question 4, there is starting to be the inference that values are for good, potentially, because the question becomes, to what extent do you consider your organisation values were supportive of your business during the pandemic? Okay, now that isn't necessarily implying that, but it's tending towards that in that direction. And then in what areas have they been most useful is the next question. So again, the inference here is that values are to some extent meant to be supportive, just so that's from a methodological point of view. But thereafter, nothing much more. So it was relatively open how people could interpret. Just thought that might help.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Really, really helpful. And Jim Hawkins has a question.
Hi, everyone. In case you don't know, I've got a career in education, really. So I've been in education management and been through this kind of process of working with teams, and we're using consultations on to come up with value statements that then we think have a chance of having a positive impact on behavior. So I'm sold on the process. I see its value, but the cynical part of me wonders and is unnerved by the sort of arbitrary nature of this, because in my 2 or 3 processes, I've come up with different value statements with teams. And for example, the way we treat others, we might use words like tolerance, or we might choose respect, or we might choose love, or honoring others' potential. And whichever you go for has an outworking that's a bit different from the other. And part of me wonders whether this is a bit like dieting. Do you choose the diet where you don't eat this bit, or you choose a diet where you don't eat that? The fact that you're actually just thinking about eating means you lose weight. So if that makes sense. So I'm interested in that process that comes up with a particular word salad that hopefully really works, as opposed to another word salad.
Yeah, I'll come to, I'm sure Ian will have who's got his hand up, will have a thought on this as well. And the last values of discovery process I did was for a global organisation, a global third sector environmental organisation. And for me, the value of the process, or the value of the process, was in the process. It was in the conversation, and in revisiting and revisiting and revisiting the conversation, not the nature of the 5 words that they landed on. That was not irrelevant, but that wasn't where the richness was. So Ian Luxford from the Motivation Agency, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, if you're coming back on that, or throw in another question.
A microphone problem at the moment. I think there seems to be a delay. Apologies for that. Yes, it was on that, and I'll be quick. So my experience is similar to yours, Jim. All I would say is I think there is a very big degree of subjectivity in the whole values process, and I think sometimes we try and make it as objective as possible because it is useful to measure it, etc., etc. And if you can have an organisation that says, well, we are trying to we want to be a flexible organisation, we want people to see us as flexible, and you can see where the customers, and people who have experiences of that organisation do use that kind of language. So there's stuff you can gear to, but I suppose the thing that I come down to relates, I think, to what you just said, Belinda, is this. Yeah, it's not necessarily very precise, but the purpose, the benefit of actually looking at your organisation and saying, what are we like, what's important to us, is quite important. And I think the alternative, which is to say we're nothing to no one, or we're everything to everyone, we have made no attempt to define what matters to us and try and prioritize certain things. I think that's it's cowardly, and it's stupid, and it's unprogressive. So I think living with a bit of ambiguity and a bit of subjectivity for me is probably better than just saying, oh, this process. I know you're not proposing that, Jim, but I just think it still moves us on.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Really nice point. Thank you, Ian. It's great to have you involved in this.
To build on that briefly, Jim, we did a very large program for a healthcare system in the Chicago area that was growing rapidly. And we first joined the senior executives at a retreat, and it was done very visually. We used one of our visual involvers to capture the output from the team. And the framework was fairly loose. But what we found remarkably is what the leadership had in their minds and the kinds of words that they expressed being important to who they were as an organization. We followed that with about 20 sessions across the healthcare system, even sitting with the crew that's in there at night, that third shift, who never see outside people come in to ask them for their opinions. And we were able to line up quite neatly what all the groups across this very diverse population, the kinds of words that they were using, which we felt in the end was very authentic. The only thing that was different is that the senior leadership team talked about being good stewards, and they were really talking about budget, and people were used to hearing that outside of the work environment, not necessarily stewardship. Really isn't a term you hear a lot in corporations. But by doing that and really listening, and I overuse the word involvement because I come from the involvement practice, but really involving audiences in the process and listening carefully to the words they're using, I think circumvents some of the things that you're pointing out. A really valid point. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tim. Half an eye on the time. Tim, I was wondering if I could come to you with a question, which is the kind of like the what next? What do you see happening next? Is that even a meaningful question? Where's this going? What have we learned, and what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I think, Belinda, there's something I can come back to. This was really reassuring to see the results of the survey that values play such an important role in culture. That's something I've long held as a belief, and I think this reinforced just how critical values are. But as the study points out, we can't have it in PowerPoints and on walls in our organizations. They have to be lived. And there's something that I learned from McDonald's years ago when I was at GE, managing the global brand, is this notion of freedom within a framework. And if you're familiar with that, there are 4 parts. We've sort of adapted it to building strong cultures inside organizations. And there are 4 parts to freedom within a framework. In our version of it, it's the organization's mission, their vision, the business strategy, and then, of course, values. Each of those have to be really clearly communicated and understood by employees. But I'm less, and maybe I'm going to be the odd person out here. I'm less. I don't believe that employees need to articulate verbatim what the values are, or the business strategy, or the mission or vision. I think they need to understand the essence of them. For us to truly live any one of those 4 items within the framework, they just need to understand the essence. I go back to my GE days, and Annette is on the call as well. We worked at GE together. In a massive organization of 311,000 people back then, it was not that important that people could articulate our values point by point. But if they knew what they meant and the intent of them, it began to shape how we were working. And I define culture as how work gets done in any organization. It began to shape in a really positive way how work was getting done, how we're showing respect for each other, how we listen to our customers, that sort of thing. So those are my thoughts. I think I was just reassured, Belinda, by the results of the survey. There were lots of really intriguing points. You'll have a chance to read through the study yourselves today. But it was kind of a good anchor to know that we're on the right track and that our work is meaningful, and engaging organizations in building strong cultures and values being a critical part of that. Belinda, how about you?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I will answer that question. I just wanted to come back to Marsha, if you're still with us, and you put a comment on the chat. I don't know if, I know you said you've got to drop off. Oh, you are. I'd love you to share that verbally before you drop off,
Sure.
if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I think, when we're talking about values and culture, and, I've obviously been listening quite carefully to the results that have been presented today. I think we have to be really clear that if your organizations or anyone that you're working with or they're not diverse in terms of having a variety of people who have a mix of visible and invisible characteristics and identifiers, that the voices of the unrepresented and underrepresented is quiet. And so a feeling that values are being lived in an organization is amplified by the majority, and dare I say, I'm making up this word, disamplified by by the unrepresented and underrepresented. So, and also in terms of narrative storytelling in these things, in minority groups, sometimes they don't feel that they can speak up, but if they do, that narrative can be seen as an exception rather than valid responses. So unless inclusivity is explicitly expressed as a value, or as an underpinning one or an overarching principle, underrepresented voices can be sort of their voices aren't heard in terms of what organizations feel are being lived in terms of values. So I don't know whether that was addressed in your research at all, but certainly, with the numbers of people who are engaging and saying, yeah, we feel our values are being lived during COVID and during lockdown, and that has been amplified. Can you really say that's a valid response for diverse organizations? And also bearing in mind, we know through a number of other measures that underrepresented groups, especially racially underrepresented groups, have been disempowered through COVID, and their voices have very much been not heard, and actually the impacts on them have been greater for a variety of reasons. So I would urge anyone who's doing values work to really be so thoughtful about the inclusion of under and unrepresented voices.
Such an important point, Marcia. Thank you for sharing that.
Really, I'm so glad you got to make that point. Thank you. And I think our respondents, as I say, were sort of more than 2/3 people who are actively involved in creating and expressing values. So, we could level it. This is people marking their own homework, and so that any blind spot there will continue to be there in their responses. And I do think there's a very interesting piece of work to be done, looking more broadly across employee populations and answering these same questions around organizational values. I think that would be, for me, the next step, and I think that'd be a very interesting thing to do. So we are coming up towards the hour. I know there's a few more comments and thoughts in the chat, which you probably won't get to address today. I want to come back to Tim's question about the kind of like the what next. I think from what we've seen, there is definitely a complexity element that I think has been creeping in for a few years around organizational values, which is inherent in the nature of how do you make them deliverable, actionable, whatever it may be. And that's led to, I think, a level of complexity in some large organizations around values to behaviors to competencies by role and level, and you get these matrices on top of matrices, which are helpful and work in some organizations, we've been told. I think also they're not helpful in other organizations, and they probably turn it into a mechanical process rather than a living, organic, reflective conversation that I think is where the real value of values is. So I don't know, discuss that's part of a bigger conversation. I think the bullshit detector will continue to be dialed up. I think, as I said, we talked about glass box brands for a really long time, but I think generational shifts, the competitive jobs market, just mean that actually you can't stick them on a wall or on your recruitment website and go, look, job done, we're values led. It's just, it just doesn't wash, and it won't wash. So I think that risk will be there increasingly for organizations. I do think there's a really interesting conversation I think is starting to happen about the relationship between company values, team values, and individual values, what that intersection looks like. Nicola, who's on the call from Aldermar Bank, was one of the things that we talked about, and I do think that is something that's going to be of increasing interest, that dialogue between individual values and company values. So there's a long way to go with this, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the challenge and the conversation conversation and the new thoughts that you've all brought to this. What happens next in terms of this call? Obviously, Tim, Ebu, and myself and the crew at FathomXP would be delighted to talk to any of you online or over coffee about organisational values and any support that you might need. In a very practical level, we will send you a soft copy of the report this afternoon. It will be available to download after that from our website in the next couple of days, and we'll include the link to that so you can get that as well. But you will get your very own copy of the report later this afternoon. Is there anything else I haven't said that I need to, Tim?
Belinda, I would just say thank you to everybody. We had anticipated we'd send you into breakouts to have conversations. You organically took the conversation to the whole room, which we love. So thank you for being such an active group today. Some really great points in the chat. We'll look forward to engaging you more with when the report goes out.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, and just again, thank you from my colleagues at Fathom to Tim and Ebu, and also Liz Barnes at Invoca as well, for all the work that you've done to support this programme, and to all of you who've been involved. And let's continue the conversation, because it's a big conversation, it's an important conversation. So thank you very much. Look forward to continuing it with you soon, I hope.